June 22, 1941. The German Wehrmacht was unstoppable. They'd rolled through Poland in weeks, crushed France in 42 days, and now they were pouring into the Soviet Union with the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. 3 million men, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces. Operation Barbarossa had begun, and the Germans were absolutely certain, absolutely convinced that this campaign would be over by Christmas. Their panzer divisions cut through Soviet positions like a hot knife through butter. Villages fell, cities burned, Red Army units scattered in confusion and panic. And then they met it. A single Soviet tank, sitting there, blocking a road junction near the town of Raseiniai in Lithuania. One tank, holding up an entire German division. The Germans fired at it. Direct hits. Panzer rounds bounced off like pebbles thrown at a castle wall. Anti-tank guns opened up. Shells ricocheted into the dirt. Nothing penetrated. For 2 days, this monster sat there, destroying German vehicles one after another, supply trucks, armored cars, even other tanks that tried to maneuver around it. The Germans tried everything: artillery barrages, aerial bombardment, engineers crawling up behind it with explosives. Nothing worked. When they finally stopped it, when they finally managed to knock out this beast and open the hatch, they found the crew inside. 5 men, dead, out of ammunition, out of fuel, but they'd held their ground until the very end. The Germans stared at this machine in disbelief. Its turret was massive, grotesquely oversized, sitting on top of the hull like some kind of industrial nightmare. And the gun? The gun was enormous, 152 millimeters. Not an anti-tank weapon, not even designed for fighting other tanks. This was a bunker buster, a fortification destroyer, a rolling siege gun mounted on tracks. The KV-2. And what happened in Raseiniai was just the beginning of a story the Germans wished they could forget. The KV-2 wasn't supposed to exist. I mean that literally. When Soviet engineers first proposed mounting a 152 millimeter howitzer on a tank chassis, military officials thought they'd lost their minds. The idea was absurd, impractical, bordering on insane. But this was 1939, and the Soviet Union had just run face-first into a problem that exposed a critical weakness in their armored forces. The Winter War with Finland. Soviet tanks rolled into Finland expecting an easy victory. What they got instead was a masterclass in defensive warfare. The Finns had built elaborate fortifications along the Mannerheim line. Concrete bunkers, reinforced pillboxes, anti-tank obstacles that Soviet armor couldn't crack. Standard tank guns? Useless. The 76 millimeter weapons on the T-34 and KV-1 could damage these fortifications, sure, but they couldn't destroy them. Not quickly enough, not when Finnish defenders were pouring machine gun fire and anti-tank rounds into every Soviet assault. The Red Army was taking catastrophic casualties trying to break through these positions. Infantry advances stalled, tank attacks bogged down. Something had to change. So Soviet military planners went back to the drawing board with a simple, brutal question. What if we just made the gun bigger? Not a little bigger, massively bigger. They took the KV-1 heavy tank, already one of the most formidable armored vehicles in existence, ripped off its turret, and designed a new one, a towering, box-shaped monstrosity that could house a 152 millimeter M10 howitzer. This wasn't a tank gun. This was an artillery piece, the same weapon used by towed field batteries to demolish buildings and fortifications from miles away. and the Soviets were going to put it on a moving platform. The engineers knew this was going to create problems. The turret would be massive, boxy, poorly balanced. The tank would be top-heavy, slow to traverse, a mechanical nightmare. The gun could only carry 36 rounds because each shell weighed 90 pounds. But when it fired, it could reduce a concrete bunker to rubble with a single shot. The prototype was ready by early 1940. When military officials saw it for the first time, reactions were mixed. Some called it brilliant, others called it a monstrosity. One engineer reportedly said it looked like someone had mounted a small building on tank tracks. He wasn't wrong. The KV-2 stood nearly 12 feet tall, towering over every other tank on the battlefield. The turret alone weighed 12 tons. The whole vehicle tipped the scales at 52 tons, making it one of the heaviest operational tanks in the world at that time. But when they tested it against fortifications, when they actually fired that 152-millimeter gun on concrete bunkers, the results spoke for themselves. Direct hit. The bunker ceased to exist. Not damaged, not cracked, gone. Production began immediately. The factory at Chelyabinsk started churning out these machines in early 1940, though production was slow, complicated by the sheer complexity of the design. Each KV-2 required hundreds of man-hours to build, specialized components, precision engineering for that massive turret ring. By June 1941, when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union had manufactured just over 200 KV-2 tanks. Some sources say 204, others claim 334 if you count all variants, but the exact number doesn't really matter because most of them would be gone within months. And the Germans? The Germans had absolutely no idea what they were about to encounter. Operation Barbarossa smashed into the Soviet Union like a tidal wave. The initial German advance was devastating, overwhelming, almost incomprehensible in its speed and violence. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed within days. Airfields were bombed before pilots could scramble. Command centers lost communication with their units. The Red Army was reeling, struggling to mount any kind of organized defense against the German blitzkrieg that had proven so effective in Western Europe. Soviet soldiers retreated in chaos, abandoning equipment, losing contact with their commanders. German panzer divisions pushed forward with confidence bordering on arrogance. Their tanks, the Panzer III and Panzer IV, had proven themselves in Poland and France. Their anti-tank guns had knocked out every Allied tank they'd faced. The High Command had intelligence suggesting Soviet armor was outdated, poorly maintained, crewed by inadequately trained soldiers. They expected the Soviet Union to be more of the same, another quick victory, another lightning campaign. Then they started encountering KV-1 heavy tanks, and suddenly the Germans weren't laughing anymore. The KV-1 was a shock, a genuine tactical nightmare the German planners hadn't anticipated. Its 75mm frontal armor was virtually impenetrable to standard German anti-tank weapons. Panzer rounds bounced off. The famous 37mm anti-tank gun, which had proven so effective in France, was suddenly worse than useless. It was a liability that gave away German positions while doing zero damage. German tank crews were panicking, radioing back reports that sounded hysterical, impossible. We're hitting them dead on and nothing's happening. Our shells just bounce off. Frontline commanders thought their men were exaggerating or breaking under stress. They weren't. The reports were accurate. The KV-1 was simply that well armored. But the KV-1 was still fundamentally a tank. It fought like a tank. It moved like a tank. It had the same tactical limitations as other armored vehicles. German forces could adapt, develop new tactics, flank it, call in heavier guns, use combined arms approaches. The KV-2, though, the KV-2 was something else entirely. When German units first spotted these machines rolling toward them, there was confusion, genuine confusion about what they were even looking at. What is that thing? Is that a tank? Is that a mobile pillbox? Why is the turret so enormous? Why does it look like someone welded a building onto tank tracks? And then it fired. The 152mm howitzer didn't just penetrate armor, it obliterated targets. German vehicles hit by KV-2 shells weren't just destroyed, they were erased, blown apart. Turrets ripped clean off hulls and thrown dozens of meters away. Entire crews vaporized by the concussive blast. Their bodies never recovered. One German tank commander described seeing a KV-2 shell hit a Panzer IV from about 800 meters. He said the entire tank jumped into the air like it had been kicked by a giant and came back down in pieces. The explosion was so violent that nearby infantry were knocked flat by the shock wave. Another report from a Wehrmacht infantry officer detailed an engagement where a KV-2 fired at a building his men were using for cover. The building was sturdy, brick construction, the kind of structure that could usually withstand artillery fire reasonably well. The 152mm shell hit the corner of the building and the entire thing collapsed within seconds, just folded in on itself, men buried under tons of rubble. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German soldiers who'd grown confident, who'd been told repeatedly that Soviet equipment was inferior and Soviet tactics were primitive, suddenly they were terrified, genuinely terrified. But here's the thing. Here's the critical problem that haunted the KV-2 from its very first combat actions. It was slow, painfully, agonizingly slow. The massive turret made the tank top-heavy and difficult to maneuver. The turret traverse mechanism was glacial, taking 45 seconds to rotate a full 360 degrees. In combat, where things happen in split seconds, that's an eternity, a death sentence. The KV-2's maximum speed on roads was about 15 miles per hour, and that was under ideal conditions with a working transmission in level terrain. Off-road, through mud or snow, it could drop to a crawl, sometimes literally walking speed. Worse, far worse, the KV-2 was mechanically unreliable in ways that bordered on catastrophic. The transmission struggled constantly under the immense weight of that turret. The engine, a V2 diesel that was actually quite good in the lighter KV-1, was pushed to its absolute limits in the KV-2. Overheating was common. Track links would snap under the stress. The suspension groaned and buckled. And there was this particularly nasty problem with the turret traverse mechanism. If the tank was on anything other than perfectly level ground, if it was tilted even slightly to one side, the massive weight of the turret would sometimes bind the traverse mechanism completely. The turret would literally get stuck, unable to rotate at all. Imagine being a KV-2 crew in the middle of combat and suddenly your turret won't turn. You've got this enormously powerful gun, but you can only fire in whatever direction the tank happens to be pointing. If an enemy tank flanks you, you can't engage. You're helpless. Crews learned to deal with this. They'd physically climb out of the tank in the middle of battle and use crowbars to manually force the turret to rotate a few degrees, then climb back in, fire, and repeat if necessary. It was insane. Absolutely insane. But that's what it took to keep these machines fighting. And in June 1941, during those first chaotic weeks of Barbarossa, Soviet logistics were collapsing across the entire front. Fuel was scarce, rationed desperately. Ammunition supplies were disrupted as supply depots were overrun or bombed. Replacement parts? Forget it. If a KV-2 threw a track or broke its transmission, there was no way to repair it in the field. So KV-2 tanks were being abandoned by their crews, not because they'd been knocked out in combat, but because they'd simply broken down. Crews would drain whatever fuel remained, set demolition charges, and blow up their own tanks rather than let the Germans capture them intact. By July 1941, most of the KV-2s that had gone into combat at the start of Barbarossa were gone. Not destroyed in glorious last stands, just lost. Left behind during retreats, burned out, broken down on the side of roads leading east. The Germans examined captured KV-2s with a mixture of fear and contempt. Fear because that 15.2 millimeter gun was absolutely terrifying, a weapon unlike anything they'd encountered. Contempt because the overall design seemed so clumsy, so impractical, so obviously flawed that it looked more like a liability than an asset. German intelligence reports from mid-1941 basically dismissed the KV-2 as a failed experiment. Too slow to be tactically useful, too unreliable to keep in service, too specialized for modern mobile warfare. The reports concluded that the Soviets had wasted resources building these things and would likely abandon the design entirely. They thought the threat was over. They thought they'd seen the last of the KV-2. They were wrong. What the Germans didn't understand, what they couldn't understand at that point in the war, was that the KV-2 wasn't designed for the kind of warfare they'd been fighting. It wasn't meant to race across the open steppe in sweeping maneuver warfare. It wasn't built for tank duels in open fields. It wasn't designed for rapid breakthrough operations or pursuing retreating enemies. The KV-2 was a siege weapon, a bunker killer, a fortification destroyer. And when it was used for its actual intended purpose, when it was positioned correctly and supported properly, it was absolutely devastating in ways the Germans were about to discover. Urban warfare. That's where the KV-2 showed its true nature. Cities and towns created exactly the environment where the KV-2's glaring weaknesses became largely irrelevant and its overwhelming strengths became absolutely dominant. Narrow streets meant maneuverability didn't matter. You couldn't maneuver anyway. Static defensive positions meant slow turret traverse was acceptable because targets weren't dancing around. And buildings, fortifications, strongpoints, those were targets the 152 millimeter gun could destroy with contemptuous ease. Let me tell you about what happened in the fall and winter of 1941 when the war shifted from mobile operations to grinding attritional combat. The German advance was slowing down. Soviet resistance was stiffening as the Red Army reorganized and brought up reserves. Battles were shifting from rapid panzer thrusts through open country to brutal urban combat in places like Leningrad, Moscow, Tula, Sevastopol. And in these environments, the few remaining KV-2s became absolute nightmares for German infantry and combat engineers. There's a detailed account from the Siege of Leningrad, that horrific battle that would drag on for 872 days of unimaginable suffering and starvation. German forces had encircled the city by September 1941, cut it off from overland supply routes, and settled in for what they assumed would be a relatively quick siege. A single KV-2, part of a desperate Soviet counterattack in October 1941, rolled into a sector where German troops had occupied several solid stone buildings near the Pulkovo Heights. The Germans had spent weeks reinforcing these structures, turning them into proper defensive strongpoints, with machine gun nests, mortar positions, anti-tank gun emplacements, observation posts. They'd done it right, following proper defensive doctrine. The KV-2 simply deleted them. One by one, methodically, the howitzer fired at each fortified building. The first shot hit a 3-story structure that housed a German machine gun company. The shell punched through the brick wall and detonated inside. The entire building shuddered. Part of the roof collapsed, and German soldiers came pouring out of the exits, some wounded, others just desperate to get away before the next shot. There was a next shot. The building came down. Second target, a reinforced stone house being used as a German command post. One shot. The corner of the building exploded outward, the structure began to tilt, and within 30 seconds the whole thing collapsed sideways, like someone had kicked out its legs. Third target, a warehouse where Germans had established an ammunition storage point. The crew loaded a high-explosive shell, took careful aim, fired. The warehouse didn't just explode, it detonated. Secondary explosions going off as stored ammunition cooked off. The blast was so powerful, it shattered windows 3 blocks away. German return fire was constant and completely ineffective. They hit the KV-2 dozens of times with everything they had. Small arms fire that just sparked off the armor, machine guns that might as well have been throwing rocks, even a 37mm anti-tank gun at relatively close range, maybe 200 meters, which scored multiple direct hits and accomplished absolutely nothing except giving away its position. The KV-2 sat there for over 4 hours, systematically destroying every fortified position in that sector of the German line. It would fire, reload, traverse to a new target, fire again. The crew was working methodically, professionally, making every shot count because they only had so much ammunition. When the tank finally withdrew, low on ammunition and with its engine overheating, the entire German defensive line in that sector had been pushed back almost a kilometer. Soviet infantry had followed behind the KV-2, exploiting the gaps, occupying the rubble where German strongpoints had been. Or consider what happened in Tula in October and November 1941. Tula was critical, absolutely critical to both sides. It was a major industrial city about 120 miles south of Moscow, and if the Germans could take it, they could outflank the capital from the south and potentially encircle it. The battle for Tula became a desperate, grinding slugging match that lasted for weeks. Several KV-2 tanks, maybe 4 or 5 according to Soviet records, were integrated into the city's defense. These machines weren't racing around the battlefield trying to fight mobile actions. They were positioned in carefully selected strategic locations and used as mobile artillery platforms, essentially armored pillboxes with tracks. When German assault groups tried to advance through the city streets, when they thought they'd cleared a sector and could push forward, they ran straight into 15 2mm hell. One German infantry officer, a captain in the 31st Infantry Division, wrote in his diary about an attack his company made on a factory district in Tula. They'd advanced carefully, using proper urban warfare tactics, clearing buildings, establishing supporting positions, and then a KV-2 rolled around the corner about 300 meters ahead of them. The captain wrote that his men immediately took cover, which was the right instinct. The KV-2's turret began traversing toward a building the Germans were using for cover, a solid brick structure that seemed safe. The captain wrote, "The entire structure came down in seconds. One shot, just one. Men buried alive under the rubble, others running, screaming, covered in dust. We couldn't advance. We couldn't even stay where we were. Every building, every position was just a target waiting to be destroyed." His company withdrew. They'd taken casualties without even engaging the enemy infantry. Just one tank had stopped an entire company's advance. The psychological impact was enormous, perhaps even more important than the physical destruction. German troops who'd grown confident after months of victories, who'd been told Soviet equipment was inferior and Soviet tactics were primitive, suddenly they were terrified to enter any street where a KV-2 might be waiting around the next corner. Soldiers who would bravely assault machine gun positions or charge through artillery fire would freeze up, refuse orders when they saw that distinctive massive turret. Some officers reported near mutinous behavior when they tried to order attacks in sectors where KV-2s had been spotted. Here's what made the KV-2 so uniquely effective in these urban combat situations. The gun wasn't just powerful, it was versatile in ways that gave the crew incredible tactical flexibility. High explosive shells for fortifications and infantry concentrations, armor-piercing rounds for vehicles and tanks, concrete-piercing shells for bunkers. The KV-2 could switch roles mid-battle, adapting to whatever threat emerged. One minute it's smashing a bunker, the next minute it's knocking out a German assault gun, then it's clearing a building full of infantry. And that armor, that thick, resilient armor, saved countless crew members' lives. KV-2s would return from battles absolutely pockmarked with hits, sometimes dozens of impact craters where German shells had struck and failed to penetrate. The armor would be scarred, gouged, dented, but intact. Crews would climb out shaken, deafened, bruised from being thrown around inside, but alive. There's a recorded incident from early 1942 near the city of Voronezh during the winter fighting. A KV-2 was supporting a Soviet infantry attack against entrenched German positions on the outskirts of the city. The tank had destroyed several German strongpoints and was repositioning when it took a direct hit from a German 88mm anti-aircraft gun. The 88 was one of the few weapons the Germans had that could reliably penetrate Soviet heavy armor. It was a beast of a gun, originally designed for anti-aircraft work, but pressed into service as an anti-tank weapon out of desperation. When an 88mm hit something, that something usually died. The shell struck the KV-2's turret at an angle, maybe 30 degrees from perpendicular. It gouged a massive scar across the armor plating, a gouge so deep you could fit your fist into it. Metal peeled away. The impact rang through the tank like a bell, and the shell bounced off. The crew inside was stunned, literally stunned by the impact. The gunner's nose was broken from being slammed against his sight. The loader had been thrown against the breech and cracked 2 ribs, but the shell hadn't penetrated. The KV-2's turret slowly, ponderously traversed toward where that 88mm shot had come from. The German gun crew saw this, realized what was about to happen, and tried to displace. Too late. The KV-2 fired. The German 88mm position was obliterated. Gun destroyed, crew killed. But these successes, these moments of brutal effectiveness, came at a terrible price that's easy to forget when we're talking about statistics and tactics. KV-2 crews lived on the edge of disaster every single day they were in combat. Mechanical breakdowns were constant, inevitable. Every time the engine started, there was a chance it wouldn't start again. Every time the transmission shifted, there was a possibility something would snap. The tanks were fuel-hungry beasts in a war where fuel was precious, rationed, sometimes simply unavailable. Ammunition was its own nightmare. Each 152mm shell weighed 90 pounds. Loading them was exhausting physical labor, especially in combat when you're working fast, when adrenaline is pumping, when you're scared and tired and the tank is rocking from impacts. The loader would be drenched in sweat, arms shaking, back screaming after loading a dozen rounds. And resupply in combat conditions was almost impossible. You couldn't just drive up to a KV-2 and hand ammunition through the hatch. Each shell had to be carefully loaded, properly stored. It took time, left the tank vulnerable. And the Germans were learning, constantly adapting to Soviet tactics and equipment. By late 1941, German forces had started deploying heavier anti-tank guns in larger numbers. The 75mm PaK-40 and the 88mm guns were appearing more frequently on the Eastern Front, rushed there specifically to deal with Soviet heavy armor. These weapons could punch through KV armor at combat ranges if they got a good shot. The Germans developed new tactics specifically for dealing with heavy Soviet tanks. They'd use combined arms, coordinate infantry attacks with anti-tank gun support, use smoke to obscure the tank's vision, flank it from multiple directions simultaneously. They learned that if they could immobilize a KV-2 by damaging its tracks, they could then take their time destroying it with heavier weapons. The KV-2, with its slow turret traverse and limited mobility, was particularly vulnerable to these evolving tactics. If a German force could get around it, coordinate attacks from multiple directions, hit it from the side or rear where the armor was thinner, the KV-2 was in serious trouble. Soviet KV-2 crews understood these vulnerabilities better than anyone. They knew every time they rolled into battle that the odds were stacked against them. If the transmission failed at the wrong moment, if they got stuck in rubble or mud, if they ran out of ammunition while surrounded by enemy forces, they were dead. No rescue was coming. Nobody could tow a 52-ton tank out of danger under fire. And yet, they kept fighting, kept climbing into these mechanical monsters every day. Soviet KV-2 crews developed a grim, well-earned reputation among both Soviet and German forces. These weren't just tank operators following basic drill. They were siege specialists, urban warfare experts who understood their vehicle's capabilities and limitations better than the engineers who designed it. They learned through brutal experience how to position the tank to maximize fields of fire while minimizing exposure to flanking attacks. They coordinated closely with infantry to protect against close-range German assault teams armed with explosives or magnetic mines. They rationed ammunition carefully, making every single shot count because resupply might not come. They developed unofficial techniques for dealing with the turret traverse problem. If the tank was on uneven ground and the turret wouldn't move, they'd rock the entire tank by revving the engine and working the clutch, trying to jostle the turret free. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Crews became incredibly skilled at reading terrain, understanding at a glance where they could position safely and where the ground would bind their turret. This wasn't in any manual, wasn't part of any training. They just learned, or they died. There's a story from the defense of Sevastopol in 1942, that brutal siege that lasted from October 1941 to July 1942, one of the longest and bloodiest sieges of the entire war. The city held out for 250 days against overwhelming German and Romanian forces. A KV-2 was positioned to cover a key road junction on the northern perimeter of the defensive line. German forces absolutely had to take that junction to continue their advance into the city. It was a critical position. For 3 days straight, that single tank held the position against continuous German attacks. Infantry assaults were shattered by high-explosive shells that turned entire squads into casualties. Vehicle columns trying to rush past were destroyed methodically. Every German assault broke against that one KV-2 like waves against a rock. The Germans tried everything they could think of. Artillery barrages that cratered the area around the tank but couldn't penetrate its armor. Stuka dive bombers that dropped bombs close enough to shower the tank with debris but didn't score direct hits. Infantry with satchel charges who were cut down by supporting Soviet machine guns before they could get close. On the third day, the Germans finally brought up multiple 88mm guns, positioned them carefully in concealed emplacements with good fields of fire, and conducted a coordinated fire mission. They hammered the KV-2 from multiple angles simultaneously, something like 15 or 20 rounds in rapid succession. Some shells missed, some ricocheted, but enough penetrated. When German troops finally cautiously approached the destroyed KV-2, they found the crew dead at their posts. The interior was a nightmare of blood and torn metal. The tank was completely out of ammunition, every single shell expended. The engine had seized, frozen solid. But until the very end, until they physically could not fight anymore, the crew had held that position. The German officer who reported the engagement, a major in an artillery regiment, wrote in his official report that his men stood around the destroyed KV-2 and didn't celebrate the victory. They just stood there, looking at this wrecked machine, exhausted and somber. He wrote that it had taken hundreds of men, multiple heavy anti-tank guns, 3 days of constant fighting, and significant casualties to destroy one tank. One tank, crewed by 5 men. This was the reality of the KV-2 in combat during 1941 and 1942. It wasn't elegant or pretty. It wasn't the war-winning superweapon that some propaganda might have suggested. But when it was used correctly, when it was crewed by determined soldiers who understood both its capabilities and its limitations, it was absolutely terrifying, a machine that could take punishment that would destroy any other vehicle and keep fighting, a weapon that could delete fortifications with single shots, a psychological hammer that broke morale in urban combat. But let me tell you about one action, one single engagement that perfectly encapsulates everything the KV-2 could do when all the elements came together properly. February 1942. The Eastern Front had stabilized somewhat after the initial German blitzkrieg had been stopped outside Moscow. Winter had arrived in full force, and both sides were locked in brutal attritional warfare across a front that stretched for thousands of miles. Near the city of Verzhev, about 120 miles northwest of Moscow, German forces had established a fortified defensive line. This wasn't hastily dug trenches or improvised positions. This was proper defensive engineering of the type the Wehrmacht excelled at. Concrete bunkers built to specific designs, anti-tank ditches dug with precise dimensions, minefields laid in overlapping patterns, machine gun positions with interlacking fields of fire, the whole defensive doctrine playbook. The Germans had learned hard, painful lessons about Soviet counterattacks over the previous months, and they'd fortified accordingly. This line was meant to be impregnable, or as close as you could get in actual warfare. The Soviet High Command wanted this line broken. They needed to break it to maintain pressure on German forces, to prevent them from regrouping or reinforcing other sectors. They'd tried infantry assaults. Those failed with heavy casualties. They'd tried armor attacks with T-34s and KV-1s. Those tanks could damage the fortifications but couldn't crack them quickly enough, and German anti-tank guns were exacting a terrible toll on the attacking armor. Someone at the division level remembered they still had a KV-2. One KV-2 attached to a rifle division that had survived this long through a combination of mechanical luck and careful, almost obsessive maintenance by its crew. The tank was a veteran by this point, scarred and battered from months of combat. The crew was experienced, hardened veterans who'd survived urban fighting in 1941. They knew their machine intimately, understood its quirks and problems. The plan was simple, brutally simple in that way desperate plans sometimes are. The KV-2 would advance directly at the fortified line under cover of smokescreen and supporting artillery fire. It would get close enough to use its 152mm gun effectively against the bunkers, close enough that even the slow-turning turret could engage targets. Soviet infantry would follow once the fortifications were breached and neutralized. Everyone involved understood what this plan really meant. It was a suicide mission. The KV-2 would be advancing alone into prepared defensive positions. Even with its thick armor, concentrated fire from multiple German anti-tank guns would eventually find weak spots. The crew would be lucky to survive. The KV-2's crew climbed into their tank in the pre-dawn darkness of February 12, 1942. The commander, a junior lieutenant whose name has been lost to history or never properly recorded, reportedly gathered his crew before they mounted up. He told them simply, "We're going to break that line or we're going to die trying. Either way, we're going forward. If any man wants to stay behind, speak now." Nobody spoke. They climbed into the tank. At 0600 hours, Soviet artillery opened up with everything they had, laying down a concentrated barrage on the German positions. Smoke shells created a thick, choking fog across no man's land, obscuring visibility to maybe 50 meters at best. And through that smoke, engine roaring, tracks grinding, the KV-2 rumbled forward toward the German line. German sentries heard it before they saw it. That distinctive sound of a heavy tank's engine, deeper and louder than lighter vehicles. The grinding screech of metal tracks on frozen ground. Then this massive silhouette emerged from the smoke, this towering shape that didn't look like any tank they'd encountered before. They opened fire immediately, following their training. Machine guns, anti-tank rifles, a 37mm anti-tank gun that was practically obsolete by 1942. Rounds sparked and ricocheted off the KV-2's armor as it continued its advance. The tank didn't slow down, didn't deviate, just kept coming. The KV-2 stopped about 400 meters from the first major bunker, a reinforced concrete structure that anchored the German defensive line in that sector. The turret, slowly, ponderously, began to traverse. The German defenders knew exactly what was coming next. They were screaming for heavier weapons, calling for their 75mm anti-tank gun to engage, but the gun crew was still trying to get into position. Too late. The 152mm gun fired with that distinctive, thunderous boom that veterans on both sides would recognize instantly. The bunker essentially exploded, not collapsed or damaged, exploded. Concrete chunks the size of small cars were blown outward in every direction. The entire structure disintegrated, leaving nothing but a smoking crater and scattered rubble. The KV-2's turret continued its slow, ponderous traverse to the next bunker in the line. Third shot. Third bunker gone. German infantry were breaking now, pulling back from their forward positions. The sheer psychological impact of watching fortifications that had taken weeks to build get erased in seconds was overwhelming. Training and discipline could only take you so far. Some soldiers simply ran. But the Germans weren't finished. A different 75mm anti-tank gun, positioned in a concealed emplacement to the flank with a good angle of fire, had been waiting for the right shot. The crew had held their fire, waited for the KV-2 to present its side armor. They fired. The shell slammed into the KV-2's side hull, the armor there thinner than the front face. Penetration. The round punched through the armor plating and entered the crew compartment, killing the driver instantly in a spray of metal fragments. The tank lurched, stopped abruptly as the dead driver's foot came off the accelerator. Smoke began pouring from the hatches. For a moment, for just a moment, the German defenders thought it was over. The monster was dead. They'd stopped it. Then the turret kept moving. The crew was still fighting. With their driver dead, with smoke filling the interior, with German rounds continuing to hammer against the hull, the remaining crew members kept operating that gun. The commander took over driving controls, while the gunner and loader continued their work. Fourth shot. A German supply depot positioned behind the defensive line erupted in flames as ammunition stores detonated. Fifth shot. The 75mm gun that had wounded them was obliterated, the gun shield torn apart, the crew killed. By now, the Soviet infantry was charging forward through the gaps the KV-2 had blown in the German line. The attack was succeeding. The supposedly impregnable defensive line was breaking. The KV-2 fired 2 more times, clearing additional paths for the advancing infantry, systematically destroying every defensive position it could identify. The gunner was working through blood and smoke. The loader was moving on pure adrenaline, arms screaming with exhaustion. Finally, when the internal temperature had risen to unbearable levels and ammunition was cooking off from the heat, the commander gave the order to abandon the vehicle. They'd done everything they could. The tank was dying. 3 crew members survived the evacuation: the commander, the gunner, and the loader. Both the driver and the radio operator were dead. The 2 survivors who'd made it out were wounded, the gunner seriously. But they'd done it. They'd broken the fortified line that was supposed to stop any Soviet attack. The German positions at Rahev were rolled up over the next 2 days as Soviet forces exploited the breach. That KV-2, burned out and destroyed, sat there as Soviet forces advanced past it. Soldiers stopped as they passed, looked at this wrecked machine, this burned-out monster that had shattered an entire defensive line essentially by itself. Some saluted. Others just stared in respectful silence. A German officer, a captain, captured in the aftermath of the battle, was brought past the destroyed KV-2 during his evacuation to a prisoner collection point. He stopped, stared at the wreck for a long moment, taking in the dozens of impact marks on the armor, the burned-out turret, the destroyed hull. He reportedly said, speaking to his Soviet guards, "We didn't lose to a tank. We lost to the men inside it." And that was the truth the Germans had learned the hard way over those months of fighting on the Eastern Front. The KV-2 was never going to win the war. Let's be absolutely clear about that. It was too slow, too mechanically unreliable, too specialized for the kind of mobile warfare that would ultimately decide the Eastern Front. By 1943, the KV-2 had been completely withdrawn from frontline service, replaced by more practical designs. The Soviets moved on to better tanks, more reliable systems, vehicles better suited to the evolving nature of armored warfare. Production had actually stopped in late 1941, partly due to the evacuation of factories and partly because the Soviet High Command recognized the design's fundamental limitations. The resources and factory time required to build one KV-2 could produce multiple T-34s, and the T-34 was proving to be a far better general-purpose tank. But for those critical years, 1941 and 1942, when the Soviet Union was fighting desperately for its survival, the KV-2 performed exactly the role it was designed for. It broke fortifications. It held impossible positions against overwhelming odds. It terrified German troops who thought they'd seen everything the Red Army could throw at them. The production numbers tell part of the story. Only about 200 to 334 KV-2s were ever built, depending on which source you trust and how you count variants. Compare that to over 35,000 T-34s built during the war, or the thousands of other Soviet armored vehicles. The KV-2 was a rare machine, a specialized tool pulled out only when nothing else would work. But its impact, its psychological and tactical impact, far exceeded those small production numbers. German military reports from 1941 and 1942 repeatedly mentioned the psychological effect of encountering KV-2s. Soldiers who'd fought bravely against other Soviet tanks, men who'd proven their courage in combat, would hesitate when they saw that massive turret. Officers reported difficulty getting their men to advance in sectors where KV-2s had been active. And that mattered. In war, morale matters just as much as ammunition or fuel. Fear matters. The KV-2 created fear in a way few other weapons did. Soviet crews who operated these machines developed an elite reputation within the Red Army. Assignment to a KV-2 unit was both an honor and a death sentence, and everyone knew it. The odds of surviving more than a few combat actions were slim. Mechanical failure would probably kill you before the Germans did. But they climbed into those tanks anyway, day after day, battle after battle, knowing the odds. Think about what that means. These men, fighting for their homeland during the darkest days of the war, when the Soviet Union's survival hung by a thread, took a flawed and imperfect machine and turned it into something the Germans learned to dread. They compensated for mechanical problems with skill. They overcame design flaws with tactics. They made it work through sheer determination. The last confirmed combat action of a KV-2 was sometime in late 1942, probably around October or November, somewhere in the ruins near Stalingrad. The exact details are lost, buried in the chaos of that apocalyptic battle. Soviet records from Stalingrad are incomplete, understandably so, given the conditions. After that, silence. The KV-2 disappears from the historical record. The surviving vehicles were withdrawn to the rear, probably scrapped for their metal or converted into other vehicles. Some might have been used for training. A few may have been kept in reserve for emergency use that never came. The era of the bunker-busting heavy tank was ending. Modern warfare was moving toward different solutions, more practical designs, tanks that could fight other tanks effectively, maneuver quickly across varied terrain, be produced in massive numbers. The KV-2 was a product of a specific moment in history, a desperate time when the Soviet Union needed something that could crack Finnish fortifications and later German defensive positions. And for that moment, it was exactly what they needed. Today, you can see KV-2s in museums scattered around the world. The Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow has one. The Parola Tank Museum in Finland has one. There are others in various collections. They sit there, these massive and ungainly machines, and most people walk past them with barely a second glance. They see this weird-looking tank with an oversized turret and assume it was just another failed experiment, another oddity from a war full of strange designs. But if you look closely, if you really look at those preserved examples, you can see the history written on them. Impact craters where German shells hit and bounced off. Weld marks where battlefield repairs were made under fire. Gouges and scrapes from combat. Paint worn away from years of hard use. Every mark tells a story. Every dent represents a moment when someone tried to kill the crew inside and failed. The Germans laughed at the KV-2 when they first encountered it. They called it clumsy, impractical, ugly, a failed experiment that proved Soviet tank design was fundamentally flawed. They stopped laughing after Raseiniai, after Leningrad, after Tula, Rzhev, Sevastopol, and dozens of other battles where that massive turret appeared and German fortifications simply ceased to exist. They learned, the hard way, that sometimes the most impractical-looking solution is exactly what the moment demands, that unconventional designs can be devastatingly effective when used correctly. And they learned that Soviet tank crews, given a weapon and a mission, would fight until there was literally nothing left to fight with. They'd hold impossible positions. They'd break impregnable defenses. They'd keep fighting with dead crew members, with broken transmissions, with smoke filling their lungs and ammunition running out. That's the real legacy of the KV-2. Not a technological marvel that revolutionized tank design. Not a war-winning superweapon that turned the tide of history. Just a brutal, effective tool in the hands of determined soldiers during humanity's darkest hour. A machine that did its job, despite all its flaws, when it absolutely mattered most. And if you've made it this far, hit subscribe. We're bringing forgotten war machines and the crews who fought in them back from the archives every week. Real history, real soldiers, real steel.